Hello and welcome to WOLV-TV Spotlight. I'm Sean Henderson, and today I am joined by an incredible guest, former HBO correspondent, documentary filmmaker, and award-winning journalist Jon Frankel. A recruited walk-on at Syracuse University for the football team, Frankel's career was cut short by injury, and then he made the move into sports television. Years later, he's found himself working at Real Sports with Bryant Gumbel on HBO, The Today Show, and producing and/or directing a number of his own documentaries, some of which have aired on ESPN. Jon, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Sean.
So I just want to start off today talking about what you're up to here at Michigan. You're teaching a sports documentary class in the communication and media department. So I'm just wondering how this came to be.
Well, it coincided. This is my third fall of teaching a class here at Michigan, and it's sort of a loose name is sports journalism, long-form sports journalism, documentary making. Truth be told, I have a daughter who's here, who's a junior. And when she was heading out of the house out of New York City and coming here, I thought, okay, this is the perfect time. Real Sports was winding down and gave me something else to do. I had taught one semester at Marist College, which is just outside of New York City in Poughkeepsie, and really enjoyed that for a fall. So I thought, oh, this is a good opportunity, even though there's not a formal communication school here, that it would be a nice experience and I could sort of help her in her transition onto college. And we have some other ties to Michigan. My son graduated from here. So it was a nice mix.
And did you ever see yourself being a teacher down the line? Was that ever a possibility?
I think I did in the sense that there was a time when I certainly wanted to be a coach. I don't know I saw myself so much in the classroom, but I guess if I did, it's because I was such a poor student. And I've always wondered why teachers, professors at the college level haven't figured out different ways to tap in to and energize and excite students who were like me, who struggle in the classroom to really, find the motivation to want to learn. And whether it's geometry in 10th grade, figuring out again how to get kids to be excited about it. And so it's interesting that at this point in my life, having been such a bad student for most of my academic career, that I'm volunteering, coaching, teaching. I did a short documentary recently about a gentleman who teaches 12th grade AP English in the Bronx. So somehow for a guy who wasn't a student, it's all revolving around teaching in some form.
And that documentary you did about the teacher in the Bronx, that was called The Teacher. That was about Rick Ouimet. How did you find his story?
I read his story in the New York Times, but it was positioned a little bit different than just being a profile about him. The article was based around the fact that Rick, who had at the time been at the school for 25 years, the same school in the Soundview section of the Bronx, had invited an author named Tommy Orange, who's a Native American, and had written a book called They're There, which is about the plight of urban Native Americans. And it came close to winning a Pulitzer Prize back in 2018. I'd not heard of the book. And that was really what it was about, because it was the first time that Rick had ever invited, as he puts it, a living author into his classroom. And he wrote out this nearly 1,000-word email to the publishing house because Tommy Orange was on a book tour and happened to be in New York. And they got back to him within 24 hours. And Tommy had said, put this on the schedule. I want to do it. What jumped off the page to me in the article was just the energy and the passion and the enthusiasm that Rick had. I just had this sense that this was a guy who was really excited about teaching, and I didn't know any of his backstory. They didn't really get into it. And they talked more about some of the statistics and where this public school fell in relation to other public schools in the city. And it was either very low or very high in the wrong areas in percentages. And so I sent Rick, I found his email online and sent him an invite to come have lunch. And, that I knew it was him right away because I see this guy who's in a short sleeve polo shirt and short pants and a small little ponytail. And he's just sort of bouncing down the sidewalk. And I'm like, that's got to be my guy. And he came in and we sat down, we had lunch in this diner, and he spoke with the exact energy that I had anticipated. And we went from there.
And this didn't really have anything to do with sports, which is what a lot of your work has had to do with. How did you kind of approach this in the same or different ways from other stories you've told that have involved sports?
I'd like to believe that a story is a story, no matter what the subject is. You want to tell a story about weather, you want to tell a story, about, an earthquake ravaging an area. To me, it's always been about the people. And I think I've tried to stress that in class, that it's characters and it's storytelling that matters. And there is a way, and I think the way I have approached my career is there is a way to address subjects or issues, but doing it through people. And I'm more subtle about it than some people might be to traditional documentary filmmaking. They might hit you over the head with the statistics and tell you this is exactly what's going to happen to this group of people, and these are the prison rates for this, and these are the failing rates in education. And I'd like to do it through this storytelling of people. And I think that in that way, Rick's story still resonates, and the plight of being a student in a public school. So for instance, using the teacher as an example, I think that what you get from that is when so many people are ready to dismiss public education and criticize public education, that Rick, along with thousands of others, don't get me wrong, I think that Rick's approach may be unique, but he as a teacher and a good teacher, an enthusiastic teacher, is not unique. I just happen to hear about his story. So there's probably thousands, but for those of us who haven't experienced it, particularly in New York City public schools, we're so quick to say, it's a failing system, it can't work. And what Rick and those students together illustrate is that it does work. If you've got the right teacher standing in front of that classroom and you've got students who are excited about it, it's like you can get a horse to water and then you can teach them to drink too.
Yeah, and you talked about how your stories have been kind of people focused or just talk about issues. And I think what Real Sports does really interestingly is those sports are obviously a part of it, given the name, that it's not always at the core of the story. I think if you take the Skid Row Run Club story that you were a correspondent for, or Huey Burton's story that Bryant Gumbel was a correspondent for, there's always sports as a part of the story, but it's not the entire thing. So with that in mind, how do you see sports fitting into the wider fabric of society?
Well, just so people understand the Skid Row story for a minute, let's go back to that, this is the story of a judge who had his own challenges growing up, a difficult family life, worked his way through college, becomes a prominent judge in Los Angeles, and basically is charged with sentencing people to some, who've committed serious crimes and been convicted, and sending them away for long periods of time. In many instances, he does not have any discretion as to how long he can sentence people for. The law is the law in California. And what he decided to do was he's an avid runner, and he started a running club on Skid Row, which is this area in downtown Los Angeles where people who are really down on their luck, people who have substance abuse issues, are homeless, have more serious mental health issues, and they're either sort of just barely surviving on the streets, or they've come out of prison but they haven't been able to get themselves going in life, and they live in shelters and such. Many of them live in tents. There's this whole encampment in downtown LA, and he got these people, many of whom had never walked more than 5 steps at a rapid pace in their life, and he got them running. And he started 3 days a week at 5 a.m. He's out there and he's got this whole troop of people running with him, and he's got volunteers. And he's now taken these people who many had never even owned a passport, and he's gotten them running marathons around the world. So that's the story. And I think with that, again, you're talking about a judge who's changing people's lives through sport. And you're allowed to examine his backstory. You're allowed to take a quick glimpse into the justice system and what may or may not be right about it. And again, in that instance, it doesn't do it by hitting you over the head and saying, look at the 3 strikes law and let's examine it and let's tear it apart and so forth. So I think that when you ask the bigger question about sports and how it relates to society, in some ways, looking where we are today, you might say sports has consumed society. And people say that there are lessons to be taken from sports that apply to life, right? And I recently read something that might revise that or amend that, which is to say that sports is life. That it really is the ups and downs, the disappointments, the dreams, the victories, the defeat. I know the high school team that I volunteer with, we just lost a playoff game. And for the second year in a row, we were bounced in the first round. But the boys went from having a 4-4 record in the first season that the school had had a team in 25 years, and then finished at 6-2 this year. So already really nice improvement, right? Learning. And as I said to them afterwards, and I don't talk a lot because I'm not the head coach or even the defensive coordinator, but I said to them, I'm sure that a lot of you had dreams all through the week leading up to this game. I'm going to be the guy who throws to the knee touchdown. I'm going to be the guy who catches it. I'm going to be the guy who makes the game-saving tackle. And it's good to have dreams. We all need to have dreams. But more often than not, our dreams don't come true. And so those are, I know it sounds so cliche, but those are the lessons. That's life, right? And so sports is life to them, and hopefully you take from that there's commitment and there's obligation and there's teamwork and there's people that, hopefully you don't have to go to war to learn this, that there's people that you would stand shoulder to shoulder with and do battle with, if you will, by playing a football game and going through training camp and all those sorts of things. So as that relates, I don't think those are, some would say, again, those are lessons learned from sports, but it is life.
Yeah. And with those stories that aren't really focused on the X's and the O's, you, at Real Sports at least, were able to find specific subjects that hadn't really gotten a national level of coverage. And I was wondering how you guys went about finding these, specific subjects.
I wish I could take credit. There's only a few stories. I would say maybe once a year we did a story that I had pitched. I would say most of the stories came from the hard work of the producers, and we had an excellent, small but excellent team. And a lot of it came from reading other things, but I think that, and that's a lot of what television is at the various stops that I made in my career is, oh, here's a good article, let's turn it into a TV story, whether it's in the magazines or in the newspapers. But the thing that the Real Sports producers were really good at was connecting dots and seeing that I read a story here, I read a story there, I saw something else about this. Wait a minute, there seems to be a trend. Maybe there's something deeper here that we need to look at. And so they would take this, an aggregate of these things and then start to dig some more. So they deserved a lot of the credit. The correspondence also often came in at sort of a later point. I mean, we were able to offer suggestions on, hey, maybe we should interview this person or that person. But the producers deserve much of the credit. And they were really good at finding things that obviously we did some of the obvious ones. To feature on Michaela Schifrin. There's big name athletes did pop up on our show. I always found the stories that you didn't know about more interesting, more appealing to me. And I think in general, the viewers found that to be the case too, because so often the big name athletes have already done enough interviews that it's pretty hard to stump them along the way. Not that we're aiming to stump them, but ask them a question that they haven't heard before.
And on the note of questions, when you're sitting down with your subjects, you guys have been able to ask tough questions or discuss difficult subjects. How do you approach asking those questions with respect and care so that the people you're talking to still feel comfortable and that they're respecting?
If I were being a wise guy as your professor, I might turn around and say, well, I've talked about that. You answer the question. But I do think that there is a way to gently disarm people. And that is, without trying to make them feel vulnerable, I think that it's okay to say, I know this is a tough question, or you might feel uncomfortable answering this, or I feel awkward asking you this question, but I really need to, or am interested to know the answer to. And I think when you bring some compassion and some empathy to your line of questioning, and you explain that you understand what you're talking about might be a tricky issue, then people are I think they're more receptive to it. If you just come out and punch somebody in the face, why'd you kill that person? That they do that too. But and I think that's true about, I've interviewed people, who've been on death row, and I've interviewed, athletes who won Super Bowls. So I think either way, when you get to something tricky, there's a way to sort of make them feel comfortable.
I mean, I reached out to you to see if we could talk about the Kevin Turner pieces you had worked on and you had previously sent me before this, because you guys had a friendship that you talked about in the Real Sports piece. And I was wondering, since you worked with him in two different contexts, how that friendship developed, because you did the solo piece, American Man.
Yes. Kevin was a guy who captained. He grew up in Alabama, in Prattville, Alabama. He captained the Alabama football team in 1992 and then played 8 years as a fullback in the NFL. At one point, he was the highest paid fullback in the NFL. And after 8 years, his career came to an end. And then we met because Kevin had recently been diagnosed with ALS and had gone public with it. And there was more and more coming out about head trauma and the effects of head trauma, and particularly how football was impacting some of these guys. And Kevin was also coaching two of his three kids, two boys. He has a girl as well. And one was in junior high and one was really learning proper one of football. And I thought, this is this interesting contrast of a guy who's learning that football may take away everything that he got in his life, fame, money, notoriety, and so forth. But here he is passing it along to the next generation. Kevin, it was just a really open guy, super sweet, really funny. And I don't think he had a bad bone in his body unless you were an opposing linebacker.
Yeah.
He wanted to deck you. And we just hit it off. I remember when I first flew down to Alabama, day one, and we met in the parking lot of a little strip mall. And he was going to drive down to his hometown from Birmingham to Prattville. And I just, parking lot, hi, how you doing? I'm John. We'd spoken at once for 45 minutes on the phone. And put a wireless mic on him, and I got in the passenger seat and started filming. And he just let it flow. And so we developed this relationship in that way. And I met his best friend, Craig Henderson, who also played football in Alabama. And the three of us pretty quickly came to realize that had we been in college together on a few years their senior, that we all would have really gotten along and been quite friendly. I think that one of the tricks that I've always used is when you can put yourself maybe not on the same plane as the person you're interviewing, but at least give them a sense that you understand their world a little bit. So by telling Kevin and Craig that I had been a recruited walk-on at Syracuse, I think that allowed them both to understand, okay, he understands a little bit of our world. I can't pretend to have been a star at Alabama the way they were and the way Kevin was in the NFL. But I think it gives you a little cred, if you will, right? And I think that there's ways to do that almost with everybody you interview. Maybe I find out you're from such and such a town. And I say, oh, I visited your town before, and I know this place and this place. Or, hey, you went to this college, and oh, I visited your college. I went to a football game there. There's just a way to sort of say, we have some ground in common here. And once you have that, once you break down that veneer and you can share those common experiences, it helps and goes a long way.
Yeah, and so you talked about how you realized you got along when you're doing your first piece. When you start doing the second story with Turner, how did things change for your guys' relationship?
So the first piece I did was a standalone documentary while I was working at Real Sports. And then along the way, Kevin became the face of the former player. He became one of the faces of the plaintiffs in the former player's case against the NFL over head trauma, what the NFL knew and didn't know. And so now he became sort of a higher profile figure. And it became of interest to us as we were following that story. And so we had reason to go back to him, and we had all the footage that I had used for my documentary. So it came in very handy. I don't know that the relationship changed that much. Maybe it was a little more professional in the way we did interviews. Kevin's health had deteriorated, so it made it a little harder to do interviews. And there were times, I think, as you've seen when you watch the piece, it got emotional, and particularly for me. And there are producers who, while they want emotion, sometimes are scared of that. And they're scared of how much of the correspondent, should be seen in that light. I don't know if you've ever seen the film Broadcast News. And there's a famous scene because they're shooting. William Hurt is the correspondent, a network correspondent, and he's doing an interview. I think it's with a Vietnam vet, and at one point he sheds a tear. And the producer watching it back in the studio in the edit room says, "Didn't you only have a one camera shoot on that? Wasn't the camera only lined up on the subject?" And he said, "Yes." She said, "So, well, how did you have the crying?" And they had turned the camera around for reverses, which was a common practice if you only have one camera. And she said, "So you faked crying. You didn't cry in the moment. You reenacted the cry." He said, "But it was a real emotion. I felt it during the interview." Anyway, I bring it up because it's a moment that was really, sort of exploited in this movie. And in the scene in one of the real sports, we always shot with two cameras, if not three or four. And I genuinely lost my emotions as I was reading an email that Ken had written to me. It was his last, or I think it was his last text that he'd written to me. I'm okay with that. I know sometimes producers, again, shudder at that. But I think that, again, when you do things with empathy, it's okay. It doesn't mean that you lose your objectivity over things. I hope I've answered your question.
Oh, no, you have. I was just going to springboard off that because obviously, as somebody who's also dealt with loss, grief is kind of an all-encompassing thing at times. And in journalism, often you have to try and remove yourself from the story. So I was wondering how, with Kevin's passing, how you tried to remove yourself almost a little bit.
I don't know if I ever really did. It's interesting because I remember when we covered the funeral and Kevin's funeral, and Dabo Sweeney was one of the people that eulogized him because Dabo, the coach at Clemson, and Kevin had been teammates at Alabama, and Kevin's older son ended up playing for Dabo at Clemson. I think there comes a point when you have a job to do, and you had to work with producers and cameramen and make sure the camera's in the right position. Do we have the right angle? Do we have him wearing a mic? Who else do I want to interview when we go to the graveside? It's, do I want cameras, or is this now a moment where I am going as a friend, and we're not going to film this part? So I think it just happens. It naturally, right? You have a job to do, and then there's other times when you're like, okay, I need to be the friend that I want to be to this person. So I think each situation presents itself differently.
And to just pivot away from that a little bit to close out today, in terms of just storytelling as a whole, how do you stay fresh in terms of creating ideas? Does the uniqueness of every individual person's experience make that easier?
I think so. And I think that there's people who write screenplays and television shows, right? It used to be this thing where there's only three different stories to tell in Hollywood. Everybody just tells them differently. But listen, everybody seems to manage to find a different way to tell the same story in Hollywood with a fresh spin and uniqueness. I don't know. I read things today and I say, oh, that appeals to me. That's interesting. Would the same thing be interesting to you? I don't know. Maybe you wouldn't think of it in terms of, hey, that's a story I want to tell. You might say, okay, interesting fact.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I think I might have talked about this in class. I recently read a story about guys men and women, who play taps for military funerals around the country because veterans are entitled to that. But they've run out of people to play taps. There aren't enough people. And it was just an article about a guy who does this. He volunteers he's a college instructor part-time, and he drives 3-4 hours to different funerals to help families put their loved ones to rest. I think that's cool. Is that a short film to do about a guy who's giving of his time and still playing taps? Again, you might read that same story and be like, okay, next.
Yeah.
So, I don't know.
So just staying current on what's going on and seeing what appeals to you?
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's harder. It's kind of like it's a little bit like somebody who's an inventor, right? What do they say? Necessity is the mother of all inventions, right? That person, if you were to sit down and say, I want to think of something that's going to change the world, you probably sit there and spin your wheels, right? Bang your head against the wall. You can't think of anything. You walk outside and it starts raining or whatever, and you're like, how come something doesn't exist to protect you when you're walking out? An umbrella. So I think that's the way. If I were to sit there and think about what kind of story do I want to tell, I would struggle. If I sit there and I read, something might pop into my head and be like, oh, that sounds interesting. Or I give you another quick example. I know we got to close on time, but when I was at the Today Show, we did a story about guys who that home milk delivery was still a thing. And we were sort of surprised to find that true in 1995. I looked up just a few days ago. Are there still people doing home milk delivery? Sure enough, there are. Family-owned dairies that have been around for 100 years plus. I was like, it'd be nice to revisit that. Tell my own version of that. So,
yeah, that makes a lot of sense. That is all the time we have, as you just noted. So thank you so much for sitting down with me. It was fantastic to hear.
Thank you. Great questions.
Thank you. That's all for this WOLV-TV Spotlight. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.